First of all, I'd like to thank Best and Krieger for giving me the invitation to speak before all of you today. And I'd also like to thank the Autry for this beautiful venue. It's really an honor to be here. Before I get started with my talk, I'm going to just give you a quick overview of what I intend to cover. The summary is basically that everyone knows that we're in a drought, a horrible drought, the worst drought in our recorded history. This is a crisis, but what not everybody also realizes is that we are in an extinction crisis as well. So I'm going to address today during my talk how these two things can be linked for finding a solution in our urban and suburban areas for using 83% less water than is currently used on our landscapes now, and for restoring the food webs and the ecosystems where we live so that we have true resilience. It's not enough simply to use less water and decrease our CO2 emissions. If we don't have healthy, functioning food webs and ecosystems, we are toast. So that is what I'm going to address today, and I'll have lots of pictures to show and move through to suggesting ways to go about this so that we can take advantage of nature's technology, because this is truly the low-hanging fruit. And what I've been struck by this morning, listening to all of these wonderful discussions and presentations, is that the kind of technology that we're always talking about using to solve the water crisis and solve water supply are gadgets and man-made solutions, and we are completely overlooking the technology that nature has provided over the last more than 50 million years. All right, so I'll get started and I'll try to stay away from the speakers. All right, so first of all, let's look at nature's technology. Native plants anywhere in the world are the technology that nature has provided. This is living technology that's been continuously refined and selected and upgraded over tens of thousands to millions of years. All of these plant adaptations have been naturally selected by the environment to cope with soil, with rain or lack of rain, to cope with insects and animals. And so we need to think of the native plants of any region as the living technology provided by nature. So oaks, for instance, have been in California for 56 million years. We know this from the fossil record. And because oaks have been in California for that length of time, they support one oak can support up to 5,000 different species of beneficial insects and animals. This idea of plants co-evolving over time with insects and animals is why you cannot just swap out a Mediterranean plant from somewhere else in the world and have ecosystem support here where we live. It doesn't work that way. And too often, even though we're a science-based technology, and all morning we've been talking about using science and technology to solve our water issue, we forget about the technology of nature. So natives, they're adapted to the rainfall. Natives have evolved so that they can survive just on what falls from the sky. They don't need smart irrigation controllers and all sorts of other things. They can get by on rainfall once established. They're adapted to the soil. They don't need soil amendments or fertilizers. And unless you landscape with natives, too often you're adding all these things which then contaminate our watershed health, or they go in runoff into our river systems and then out into the ocean, cause nitrogen blooms and kill fish. So natives, they're adapted to the soil just the way it comes. Then they're also adapted to climate. This is a great example. This is a turtleback plant from Death Valley. And if you look at the leaf color, the leaves are gray to reflect the light. Then the shape of the plant is a dome, so that when the leaves transpire, the water that is breathed out is then trapped by the dome, and then the plant breathes back in. It's sort of like what Eric Hoke was talking about and Paul Gagliardo about no wastewater to the ocean. It all just goes in a loop cycle. This is that plant. Then you also have natives that are adapted to wildlife. Our native sages, for instance, have evolved with hummingbirds and other long-tongued types of pollinators so that the flower structure favors those types of pollinators. And then insects and animals themselves have also evolved to be in a symbiotic relationship with the plants. So for instance, here we have a spring azure type of butterfly. This butterfly's caterpillars can eat only the young fruit of our native lilacs and also the leaves of the native types of dogwood. So if those two types of plants go away, this butterfly goes extinct. That's why having Texas privet here just sucking up water and feeding virtually nothing really doesn't make sense. You could have a hedge with ceanothus. So insects and animals have co-evolved with our native plants over millions and millions of years. Here's another example. This is the California sister. Its caterpillars can only eat the leaves of our evergreen oak trees. Now, we have incredible plant richness, and I'll get to something about this later in terms of what you see when you go to Home Depot and Lowe's. But California has over 6,000 species, subspecies, and varieties of California native plants. Over a third of them are not found outside of our state. We are a hotspot for richness of plant, insect, and animal life, and we are one of the most population-pressured, habitat-threatened places in the world. And in our urban and suburban areas, we could actually make a positive change in what is happening to our landscapes now. So we have this plant richness because we have incredible landform richness. If you look at our state, it's about 800 miles long, 250 miles wide, and about 50% of the state is mountains, each with approximately 4 sides, and they all vary in distance from the ocean and from the equator. So when you add all those variables, north, south, east, and west, distance from ocean and equator, say 8 mountain ranges as you go from west to east, all that makes for different habitats, which makes for an incredible variety of native plants. And we should be using these plants as the low-hanging technological fix for using less water in our landscape. So California natives use approximately 1/7 the water of most non-natives. They know how to deal with drought because they've evolved in drought. Drought is nothing new to California, as you saw this morning, and for the plants, that holds true as well. Now, they don't need fertilizers, soil amendments, or pesticides, and let's look at the pesticides because Monsanto and DuPont have done a really good job at convincing people that insects are bad. Well, nothing could be further from the truth for 99.9% of all the insects out there. So in California, with this incredibly rich plant palette, we have native plants for full sun, native plants for dry shade, not wet shade, dry shade. Native plants for clay soil, no soil amendments needed. Clay is great, it holds the water and the nutrients. We also have native plants like this yellow type of flannel, it's yellow flannel bush, that takes no summer water and it's evergreen. Then we have native plants for all of our different kinds of insects and animals. This, for instance, is a toyon, and those are cedar waxwings. I had never seen cedar waxwings in my life until I planted 2 toyons in my yard in 2001. I ripped out the lawn, ripped out the rose bushes, planted these 2 toyon amongst other plants, and one morning when my kids and I were heading off to school, we heard this chirping and singing in the backyard. We went into the backyard and 200 cedar waxwings were there in February on Valentine's Day eating the toyon berries. They're berry-eating birds. They co-evolved with the toyon, migrating from Central and South America in winter up to Canada, and they fly over Southern California just as the toyon berries come ripe. That's an example of coevolution and how we need to keep that in mind when we landscape, because there's more going on than just water. So we should be landscaping with this incredibly rich palette of native plants. And landscaping with natives is nothing new. Here's French native boxwood in the wild. And here it is in Paris under Napoleon. Here are Japanese pines and maples in the forest, in the mountains outside of Kyoto. And here is the Silver Temple Garden inside the city. So the Japanese have been landscaping with their native plants and creating exquisite gardens. And the French have been doing that. And at the Theodore Payne Foundation, we are showing people how they can also do it. You can have a beautiful evergreen yard with flowers year-round that uses 83% less water. So when we talk about native landscapes, though, to many people, and I do this at outreach events all the time, people look at me and they kind of cock their head and they say, "Oh, you mean you want me to garden with weeds?" And then I show them a picture like this and I say, "Well, do you think this landscape is native?" 90% of the people that I talk to say yes. Well, is this native? Absolutely not. Take a look at this. Is this native? What do you think? Yes or no? Who says yes? Raise your hand. Okay, who says no? Raise your hand. Okay. That is definitely yes. That is all California native. Here's another one. And another with a swale. And these are all on our native plant garden tour that we hold every April. And flowers, we have flowers. That's another misconception that people often have. They say, well, California native plants don't make flowers, right? And I say, well, actually they reproduce like other plants everywhere else in the world through flowers. And so there's this huge inferiority complex that people have about our native landscape. And then they often think that if they go from a green lawn and roses to a water responsible landscape, it's got to look like that blasted heath one that I first showed you of gravel and cactus. Nothing could be further from the truth. There is a huge middle ground for water savings and ecosystem support with native plants. So we need to embrace nature's technology to conserve water and support the diversity of species that we need for our own well-being, for ecosystem services, and for beauty in our lives. All right, so this was a graph that Bill showed earlier about the drought, so I'll skip that. And I'll just say that when the vast majority of our population increase occurred in California in the last 100 years, it was during one of the three wet centuries during the last 4,000 years. And combined with the fact that people wanted landscapes that reminded them of where they'd once lived, and the fact that it was raining an adequate amount, people put in lawns and all sorts of water-thirsty plants, not thinking that drought is actually normal. But we know that drought is normal for California. Predominantly dry periods are the norm. But we've landscaped as if the drought years are the exception when they're actually the rule. So combine the way we've landscaped with the fact that 20% of our energy use in California is for pumping and treating water. Then add to that in our urban and suburban areas, 50 to 70% of our water use is on landscaping. So given that we have such an incredibly rich native plant palette that uses 83% less water than non-native plants, and that we're putting all this energy into moving and treating water to get it here and then putting it on landscapes right now that do not support the ecosystem and use 6 times more water, we must also factor into the equation that we're in an extinction crisis. We are in a 6th mass extinction. Does everybody in the room know that? Okay, the World Wildlife Fund in 2014 came out with its 10th Living Planet report. They surveyed 3,000 different species in 10,000 different populations around the world. And with this report, they found that since 1970, we've lost 52% of all the vertebrate wild animals on Earth. Fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and animals, 52%. Then you combine that with the fact that we all know that our pollinators are crashing, and there was this recent report on the state of the birds that 2/3 of the birds in North America are at moderate to high risk of extinction unless meaningful conservation action is taken soon. So we need pollinators, and I don't mean just bees. Bees are hugely important, our native bees especially, because our native bees don't make honey and they don't make hives. They're up to 250 times more efficient at pollinating than the European honeybee. But in addition to the native bees, beetles they pollinate more plants than bees, and there are all different types of insects that are pollinators, and we need to support them. And the way that you do that is through the native plants that they co-evolved with. We need birds. They perform 17 different ecosystem services. We need lizards. This lizard keeps us free of Lyme disease. The western fence lizard has a protein in its blood that when the baby ticks latch on, the protein in the lizard's blood cleans the Lyme disease out of the tick. And then when the tick bites you, you don't get Lyme disease. That means we avoid the $6 billion in healthcare costs that they incur in the Midwest and the East Coast because of Lyme disease. We are free of that because of this lizard. We need to support him. So we've got an extinction rate that's 1,000 times faster than the normal background rate. Before people came on the scene, 1 species per year per million went extinct. Now approximately 14 to 28,000 per year are going extinct. We have increased drought, increased extremes of heat and cold. So we need to create sustainable, resilient cities that can absorb, shock, and maintain function. And that's the key, is that we need to have cities that can absorb the shock and maintain function of pollinators and of watershed plants that can clean the watershed. We need all those ecosystem services. So we should not squander. The logical conclusion is that we should not squander our water and energy resources on ornamental, non-native plants in our urban and suburban areas that do not support the ecosystems and don't feed people or wildlife. That makes absolutely no sense, and yet that is what we do. So the science of coevolution is that 90% of all leaf-eating insect species can eat only native plants, and that's because they co-evolved. So we need insects. You all know that we need insects. They're pollinators, food for other insects and animals. They're decomposers of organic waste, and they regulate other organisms. As E.O. Wilson said, insects are the little things that run the world. Here's an example of the pale swallowtail. Those are its caterpillars' only food. We have over 100 species of butterflies in Southern California, and 9 out of 10 of them have caterpillars that can only eat native plants. Now this matters, and natives make 35 times more caterpillars than non-natives. This matters because caterpillars are the main food of baby birds. It takes 100 to 150 caterpillars to feed 1 finch-sized bird from the time it hatches until the time it fledges 17 days later. Think of all those ornamental non-native plants that just suck up water, don't produce the caterpillars, and then our birds go hungry, and then we don't get their ecosystem services or their beauty. So, only native landscaping addresses both the extinction crisis and the water crisis. We need to think of native plants as essential infrastructure for ecosystem health, resilient cities, and wise use of our water and energy resources. California needs widespread native plant availability. We don't have it. But if you go to Australia, at Bunnings and at Masters, you can find hundreds of species of native plants, of Australian native plants, and over a third of them are all local, just to that region. I was shocked when I went there. So here's Bunnings. Here's Masters. And then the thing that further shocked me is that Masters is 50% owned by Lowe's. You go to Lowe's today, if you find one native plant out of the hundreds of species that they carry, you'll be lucky. Because Lowe's, and I've talked with their management, they have absolutely no incentive to carry native plants. Why? Because their nursery profits go down because they won't sell as much fertilizer, pesticides, or soil amendments. So a market solution for getting Lowe's to carry them has to be something else, because their business is doing just fine. Why would they want to change? If you go to Home Depot, they're becoming enlightened slowly. They have a Smart Planet section. But without widespread availability, people resort to this. And this is where we need a systems way of thinking instead of the silo thinking that we're in now. We need to realize that everything is connected. The way we use water is connected to ecosystem health. Artificial turf increases the heat island effect, which increases energy consumption for cooling the house, and then that further drives climate change. This is not good. Or people do this. This was a classic turf terminator landscape with gravel, more heat island effect. And it also harms the food web because those are all non-native plants. Then you get this. This is decomposed granite. Again, no shade trees to cool the house and no native plants to support the food web. So, furthermore, we get things like this. This is a California-friendly landscape. And I say that if it doesn't support life, it is not California-friendly. If it's sterile, it is definitely hostile. So we need healthy functioning food webs and ecosystems where people live. And we need to have imaginative lateral thinking for the benefit of those people that will follow us. So here's Mulholland. He was a visionary 100 years ago. He brought water to LA. And for the next 100 years, California needs similar vision and leadership. A good analogy is the Park Service. They started by marketing their products. And then they evolved into enlightened stewardship. Water companies and cities must also evolve into enlightened stewardship of their product. We must support native plants as part of essential water infrastructure. And there are three things that must happen if we are going to make it out of the next 100 years with our landscapes and our way of life looking similar to what they do now. We have to fund public education so that people know that drought tolerant is not enough, that we have to landscape native. We have to create native plant nurseries everywhere so that people don't have to drive more than 5 miles to get a native plant. Then we also need to retrain our maintenance professionals so that they know what to do with the native plants. And without these three components, we will continue to tinker at the margins when we need a systems-based solution that addresses the fact that all of these things are interrelated. So, As E.O. Wilson has proposed in his book, Half Earth, setting aside half of the land mass on the planet for reserves for plants, animals, and insects, so that we maintain the ecosystem service and the richness of life that we have, I propose that by the year 2050, we do a 50-50 goal, because people are much better at meeting goals than working through a process. So here's the goal. By 2050, we should have half, 50% of all our urban and suburban landscapes landscaped with native plants in species and in the biomass. And that is what we all need to work for. So as Paul Gagliardo said earlier today, that's the goal, and then I leave it to all of you to figure out how to do it. Thank you very much.